Hello, everybody. So, yes, I'm super excited to have Chris here. Like I said, I've been hoping to get her down here for several years, and I'm glad that this worked out so that she can share with all of us some of her experiences. So she's my dad's youngest sister, grew up on a small dairy farm in western Massachusetts in a town called Southampton, which has actually served as kind of a second home for me. And sort of like Josh said, she's one of the most authentic people I think I know in my life, and has been a true inspiration for me. She's had a very interesting path so far in her life, and I'm, again, just really happy that she's going to share snippets with us today. For a little bit of background, after graduating from high school in western Massachusetts, she went out to Wisconsin to Beloit College for her undergrad and majored in French, which she actually ended up using throughout her whole career. And then from there, she was a Peace Corps volunteer for 3 years in Togo, teaching English as a second language, and then for the next 7 years worked for the Peace Corps as a staff member, first as an education program director in Burundi, and then as a country director in Zaire. And after that, she worked for 30 years for the African Development Foundation, which is a congressionally funded U.S. government agency, which has kind of been on the chopping block recently. So in total, she's spent time working and visiting about 25 different countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And then after she retired in 2018, she moved back to Southampton to the farmhouse in Western Mass where she grew up. And in retirement, she immediately got to work and has been very involved in the community there. She served on the select board since 2019 in the town and is now chair of the select board, and has really shaken things up from, used to kind of be an old boys network there, and so it's been really fun to watch Chris shake things up. And so even though she hasn't traveled to Africa since retirement, she remains involved with a local NGO in Congo called Rev Kendall, serving on the board of directors. The organization's working on building schools, bringing clean water to the village, and starting some market gardening there. And just as an aside, when she worked for the African Development Foundation, my older brother and I had the opportunity to go with her for 5 weeks as she traveled to Lesotho, Botswana, and Zimbabwe. In the course of her work monitoring projects and checking out new potential projects. I was 12 at the time, so you can imagine how impactful that experience was for me. So I'm very excited, again, that she's here, and she's got some awesome pictures to show and stories to tell. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, unless you want me to.
No, that's fine. So how do I make it start?
So okay. You're just going to see those. I'll control it on the screen. Tell me when you want me to start.
Okay, so he's going to control it.
You're going to control it.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right.
And we'll just flip through them on separate, right? So just so you can see this.
Perfect. All right. Well, let me give a little bit more of a background. First of all, thanks everybody for showing up this morning. And I must say, it's great to be down here. I didn't really know where to start when Gretchen said, could you come and do this? And it's like, well, sure, but what do you want me to talk about? You know, like, I don't know what to talk about. So anyway, just to fill in a couple gaps here of linking things up. So I told Gretchen that I would title this my Unplanned Journey, which is pretty much what has been. I didn't start out with an idea of what I was going to do or where I was going to do it at all. And it really kind of recaps for me as I was thinking about this that for all of us, I think life is just a series of choices, right? You come to a fork in the road and you figure out, am I going to go straight? Am I going to take a U-turn? What am I going to do? But no matter what you do, it's going to take you somewhere. You just don't know where it's going to go, right? It's really not necessarily a right or wrong answer or direction to go in life. So today's going to give you a little bit of a recap of some of my background, but underlying theme of it is both my love of agriculture and my involvement in agriculture coming from the farm all the way through my career, and basically a life of service, so trying to give back. It all started, as Gretch said, on a small family farm. I probably started when I was about age 5 and I had my first calf. My dad gave me my first calf and I got to be in 4-H and stayed in 4-H all through my high school years, exhibiting our cattle at local and county fairs. That was probably the impetus for lots of things agriculture related and leadership related. My first experience with Africa was really probably around 6th grade or so. My folks used to, from time to time, welcome African students or foreign students to the farm just for a weekend or maybe a week to just sort of see how we did farming in the US. And so one weekend we had 2 Ghanaians that came to the farm and stayed just for the weekend, and they were 2 gentlemen from Ghana. And Ghana had just become independent in the early 60s, so this was relatively new, but I remember vividly them talking about the new president. They were so excited that they had their independence as a country. So this is probably the mid-60s. So that was something that really started to percolate behind the scenes that I really didn't know, but I learned a lot about Africa right then and there. By the time I got to high school, jumping forward, the only 2 things that I think I could say that I was sure of: didn't want to be a teacher, and I was going to be an interpreter at the UN. That was the goal. That was the plan. So with that goal, I applied to a lot of language colleges in the Northeast, namely Middlebury, Colby, Bates, and hoping to get into a good language program that could get me to that goal. And luckily, our college, our high school rather, had a college night where admissions counselors came and tried to persuade us all to go to whatever their college was. I had done my couple. I'd gone to the Middlebury one and the Colby one, and they were all kind of alphabetical. So Bates was next. The person from Bates never showed up. So I said, well, I've got another hour to kill, so where am I going to go? I went next door, and next door was Beloit College from Wisconsin. I'd never heard of it in my life, right? But I went to that and got immediately swayed by the sort of Midwest hospitality and just welcoming speech, anyway, that somebody gave to me and managed to convince me. And lo and behold, I decided to go and got accepted to Beloit in a very great language program, which took me overseas too for a college semester abroad in France. But again, not straying too far from agriculture, I ended up staying on an extra month after my required semester and worked on a dairy farm down in the southern part of France near the Pyrenees. So I had connections and made some contacts and found a dairy farm that was willing to have some stranger come and live with them for a month as long as I did the work. So that was fine. I knew how to milk a cow and I knew how to do a few things around the farm, so that wasn't a problem. By the time I got through Beloit, it was time to think about grad school, maybe. All of my friends, my closest friends in school, were applying for grad school, so there was a lot of peer pressure. I had really no interest in grad school. It's like, no, remember, I didn't want to be a teacher anyway, so didn't think about grad school very seriously, but was on the cusp of actually applying. I was certainly researching, but I hadn't applied yet, and all of a sudden, the Peace Corps recruiter came to campus, and it was like, that just took my attention completely. So that was the shortest story. I called home and said, Mom and Dad, I've applied to the Peace Corps and I may be going to Africa. And it was like, mind you, this is from Wisconsin to Massachusetts on the phone. It's like, okay, well, whatever you want to do, if you think that's good for you, we'll support you. So that was fine. So sure enough, I got accepted, graduated in May, and within probably 6 weeks, I landed in Africa. But in between time, they sent me my assignment, and I was going to go to Togo. So if you want to put up the first one with the map. Now, you can't see it very well. On the very far left, Josh, you can point it out. So between Ghana and Nigeria, right in there's a tiny little sliver of a country called Togo. When I first got the letter, I thought it was Tonga. I had no idea. I'd never heard of Togo. Never studied Africa in my high school years or anything. We didn't really talk about Africa in my history classes or geography classes, so I had no idea where it was, but it turned out to be Togo. So that was fine. Got on a plane with a bunch of people and ended up in Togo, and when I got off the plane, it was hot. It was just different. It was lots of new smells, lots of new everything, and it was like, I said to myself, and I still remember, it's like, all right, I'm going to give this 6 months. So 6 months turned into 3 years. I became a teacher, so I was an English teacher of English as a foreign language. So yes, you got that sort of quirk there. Yes, I became an English teacher. Teacher of English as a foreign language in a junior high and high school. And while I was there too, I was, I was very eager, like all of us. I was fresh out of college. We were all, eager do-gooders, save the world, go help, do whatever, right? And lots of ambition, lots of energy. And only then did I start to learn how to slow down a little bit eventually. It took a while, but the pace of life is a little bit different than it is here in the States, obviously. One of my tasks, though, at the school, in addition to teaching, and I had classes, probably about 70 students in a class, and I had 5 different levels. So it was quite a nightmare. But I remember vividly my first semester, I diligently did all the things you're supposed to do, like the seating plan and memorizing the names of all my kids, and I did pretty darn good at it. Then we had a break. I think we went away. It was summer break. Came back the next semester, and something had changed politically in the Congo, and authenticity had hit. So no longer were Christian names allowed. Everybody had to be more authentically African. So that meant that everybody's name changed. So instead of Joe, Tom, and Harry in my class that I had diligently memorized, that Joe was sitting over there, kids were now named by the day of the week they were born. So you were born on a Monday, you were Kojo. If you were born on a Thursday, you were Kwame. If you were born on a Friday, you were Kofi. And the girls similarly. So they only had 7 choices. So you can imagine how many Kojos I had in a classroom, right? I mean, everybody that was born on Monday was a Kojo. So that was my first lesson in trying to sort of control things. It's like, no, this is out of my control, totally. So that was sort of the beginning of slowing down. The other thing, though, just briefly at the school, I got involved in coaching basketball, girls basketball. And we formed a team, had some great competitions with the neighboring villages, and we were doing so well we wanted to put on a tournament. So I said, well, I'm going to reward the kids. We're going to get some uniforms. So I sprung for the uniforms, right on down to the sneakers and the whole bit, got them, and one day before practice, we had the uniforms out and people were trying them on, and I left them at the school to get themselves organized with their uniform, whichever one they wanted to choose, and then come and meet me down in the playground area where the dirt basketball court was. And I waited and waited and waited, and they didn't show up. I was like, what is going on? So finally, after about 15 minutes, I said, all right, this is crazy. So I went back up to the school, and lo and behold, I had no idea that the problem that they were having was none of the girls knew how to tie their sneakers. They had never had a pair of shoes. They played barefoot, obviously, and it just didn't connect with me when I was trying to do good and, trying to be the problem solver from outside the country, obviously, and not paying attention to what I was seeing inside the country and knowledge of my kids' home life. So they humored me for a couple games, but by the time the tournament came, they were barefoot. It was fine. So anyway, three months of that was soon 3 years. You normally would do a 2-year stint with Peace Corps, and I extended for a 3rd year because I enjoyed teaching so much, oddly enough. Then post-Togo, there was a possibility to go to grad school. I was like, got back to the States. I really didn't want to go to grad school, but again, I didn't know what I was going to do now that I was done with Togo. I must say, coming back to the States was a bit of a culture shock. Just walking into a grocery store and seeing everything we have on the aisles of the grocery store, especially the cat and dog food aisle, which I'm a cat and dog lover, but looking at the opulence and everything we have is like, my heart kind of sank and said, oh my God, this would feed that village for a year. Just the stuff on the aisle was just amazing. So it was a real change coming back to the culture of the US and the fast pace, and I really wasn't sure that I wanted to do grad school, but I did apply, and I decided to go into, lo and behold, international education. So I decided to go for my master's in international ed at UMass. Did about a semester or so, and then I got a phone call out of the blue one day. Some guy on the phone said, are you Chris Fowles? And I said, yes. Didn't introduce himself. He said, I hear you like to drink beer and play basketball. I was like, who are you? And it turned out to be somebody from Peace Corps headquarters that somehow had heard of me and said, we'd like to offer you a job in Zaire, or the Congo then. So sure enough, I gave up grad school in a heartbeat, never finished, and went to Zaire to become the director of education. And the rest is kind of history from there. So that's kind of the short story of it. And then after my time there, I came back and got involved in the U.S. African Development Foundation, which is a grant-making organization funded by Congress, created by Congress specifically to do grant making to rural populations, namely agribusiness, so farmer cooperatives and women's cooperatives, small businesses are mainly what I was in charge of doing. So identifying groups in Africa, grassroots groups that were serious about trying to improve their condition. They'd identified a problem, they decided to work together and come to solve that. So I was the grant maker person. It was very, very wonderful job in that I got to have one foot on each continent. I traveled probably 3 times a year to Africa, 6 weeks at a time. So I was probably more comfortable in Africa. I know more about Africa than I do in the western part of the US, I must say. So with that, let's just go into some slides. I'll try and give you a little bit of a rundown of things here. Just to talk a bit about agriculture as the underlying theme, I guess. Agriculture anywhere is, open to the whims of Mother Nature. Water is certainly, a big challenge all over Africa. And we'll just kind of go through a couple, Josh. So this is up in the Sahel area, up in the Sahara Desert area. Not much possibility there for water. We, as the foundation, one of the projects we had done was help them rehabilitate an old well that had been put in by French colonialists way back when. And that well at least provided water for the neighboring nomads that were going through the desert. So those that were, with their sheep, their cattle, their camels, that at least had places to stop and water their animals throughout that area. And it became, quite a successful project to allow them to at least survive in their normal pastoralist life, right? But going on to water itself, just such a necessity that I think sometimes we take for granted. We turn on the faucet oftentimes and just let it run and don't think about it. I think we're getting better about it. I think we're learning more about conservation methods. But the life of kids, the life of women in particular in Africa is very hard. It's very tedious. Kids maybe aren't going to school. Why? Because they're out doing chores like this, bringing water home, if they're lucky to have water nearby, to bring it home for just basic family, from bathing to cooking to whatever else. This is an area in Mauritania, so the far west of the continent, next to Senegal. Incredibly dry area, and this was an area that they wanted to make a garden of. And I first saw this and I thought, oh my God, what is possible here? But lo and behold, we helped them with some animal traction. So this is just your simple little plow, a donkey plow. So this was a demonstration day where they were demonstrating with the donkey and then with a pair of oxen how to use this little rudimentary plow. Of course, they had to train their animals a little bit too to pull the plow, but it was a tedious operation. And then eventually, the women were actually out there sowing the seeds, just everything by hand. A lot of the women's work is backbreaking work. They work all day long. Part of the grant we ended up helping with in a different country. This is not the same country, but we ended up helping introduce some new technologies. So to make life a little bit easier, but again, trying to look at what the needs were from their perspective and how things could be improved. So this is actually some drip irrigation that was introduced in a big market garden area, which turned out to be fairly popular, fairly successful. So drip irrigation, and then the next one shows a bit of a solar panel. So this was a solar panel hooked up to a water tank. So this was running the water pump, solar water pump, to irrigate the garden. So lo and behold, things do grow, even in the dirt, even in the desert. And these women were particularly proud of their beets and their carrots that they wanted to show off. This guy with his cabbages was just phenomenal. It just shows just a little bit of resource and helping people get access to resources, get access maybe to seeds, maybe a little bit of fertilizer. Just back up a second, Josh, I'm sorry. This is a big field of onions. So this would be up in Niger, which is up right above Nigeria. So not to be confused with Nigeria, but Niger is a French-speaking country right in the desert area. And onions, the red onions are like one of their major products. So this was a field of onions, and then these are the onions harvested. They get sorted out, and then they get bagged up and then shipped on down to the coast, so down to the coastal countries where they get sold. So growing onions was great. Growing other market crops, lettuce was a big one, tomatoes, all those kinds of things. Okra was another big one. This is potatoes. This is in East Africa. So again, the richness of the continent is just understated. I think there's so much going on, and there's so much variation from region to region and country to country. This is women in Rwanda. This is growing rice. So this is planting rice in the rice paddies. And again, all these would be commercialized here. Who knows what that might be?
Compost?
No?
It's a nut.
Cashews?
You got it, cashew. So this is what's called a cashew apple, okay? And see that little brown thing hanging down there? That's actually your cashew, your nut. So the cashew apple is actually used for medicinal purposes. But the nut itself is the challenge. And the nut's very caustic. It's got a caustic chemical in it. So the women wanted to learn how to do more processing. So what they do now, this is part of the process. They gather all these nuts, then they cook them, they fire them. This one, her fire got a little out of control, I would say. There's a little bit of grease in that oil skin here. But yeah, so then basically the women they just gathered around. This is a women's cooperative that sat around to process cashews. And what they were doing is just simply sitting on the ground and hammering with a stone, splitting off the nut. So the outer nut is a darker color, and then that gets split off into the actual cashew that we know inside yet another nut. So it's very tedious. And this is just sitting there with a rock and another rock and pounding them. This was supposed to be an improvement that somebody introduced where they would just crack the nut, but literally one by one by one. It was just a nightmare. And you'll see she had gloves on there because it is a caustic shell on the cashew. But by the time they get done, this was their processing and their sales booth for their cashews. Now I'd say here probably we only get the whole cashews, right? But they sell the broken ones with no problem. Moving from that, another typical project in Western Africa in particular is shea butter, which I think we're all kind of familiar with now in our lotions and whatever else. So shea butter comes from the shea tree, which takes about 20 years, I think, to mature. But once it matures, it gives shea nuts for over 100 years. So it's a long-lasting tree, but it takes forever to get to harvest point. Women would harvest all the nuts that fall to the ground, again, roast them, very traditional roasting, kind of a rotisserie kind of structure that they would have built in the village to roast the nuts. And again, trying to process them. A lot of it turns into kind of a paste to start with, and then it's almost like a peanut butter as they keep swirling it, and then eventually they filter it down, and some oil comes out of these nuts after a long process. I'm really abbreviating the process, but oil comes out, and then you've got barrels of shea butter like this that then get sold to various groups. I'm trying to think of the famous one. One of the cosmetic companies. Blanking it out right now. But anyway, this ends up getting exported to other countries in say South Africa or Europe, and oftentimes to the States. L'Occitane. Yeah. So that would be the one that would be a recipient of something like this. So again, crops, agriculture, all really, really important. Jumping from the west to the eastern part of the continent, much more highlands, much more green. This is the Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi area, and eastern Congo. These are tea fields. These are tea plantations. So this is owned by a cooperative of about 5,000 people. They've all joined together to be part of a cooperative, and this is the overview of the tea fields. This is on picking day, so they would assign people. They go out and they go through the rows religiously and just pick the top 2 leaves of the tea plant as they go through, and that's your green tea. So it's just a tedious process. You notice a little bit in the background, the hillsides there are very steep. They're actually, terraced, thank you. Terraced hillsides just to keep out erosion as much as they can. And then this is when they've picked their tea, then they have to come and weigh it. They get paid for how much they've picked. And then it gets packed up on a truck and again, shipped off to tea auctions in the bigger cities. Who knows what this might be? Yeah, coffee cherries, as they're called. Yes, so this would be what your coffee really starts as, okay, coming off the coffee bush. So coffee cherries, again, sorted by hand, sorting out the rotten ones, sorting out the spoiled ones, the ones that are not perfectly shaped, and then coming on down to another shelling process and drying process. So this is just laying out the coffee bean itself. This is before roasting, so they're all this kind of blondish color. And so they're just, again, a lot of manual labor to go into something that we might take for granted about, oh, gee, as I drink my cup of coffee, I had no idea it came from here, kind of thing. But it really takes a long time to go through this process. Jumping ahead to another kind of activity. So oftentimes when I think people think of Africa, they think handicrafts first, maybe, before they think agriculture. Handicrafts exist, but finding handicrafts markets is really tough. It really depends a lot on the tourist market. Africans don't tend to buy them that much themselves. However, this is one group in Burkina Faso that make the cloth. If you see the blue striped cloth that they're wearing, this is the cloth that they actually weave themselves. So this is a couple of women just making their skeins of yarn for the garment that they're going to be weaving. And go ahead, Josh. This is them actually dyeing the wool. The cotton. They would have gotten cotton. Some is locally produced, but most of it is not. They have to bring it in from another country. But they would dye the cotton and then have their gorgeous colors here. Most of this would be, some of it could be local dye, but a lot of it is imported chemical dye. But just lovely colors, and then finally weaving it into these long strips. It could be nice tablecloths sewn together. They're just gorgeous pieces of material. Another one of a women's entrepreneur business, and that group there in Burkina with the weaving actually does export their cloth because it's traditional cloth. They actually now have an export market in Europe. And so you'll find somewhere on the fashion runways of Paris and Germany and whatever else, you'll find people that have got accent pieces, not the entire shirt perhaps, but an accent piece that is that woven cloth. So they've done really, really well. This is a group of women in Rwanda that live right next to Lake Tanganyika. Normally, these are not traditional activities for women to do any kind of fishing. These are special canoes that they go out. There's actually two that are latched together. They go out at night and they fish, and what they're looking for is the next one, which is called kapenta. This is almost like a little small anchovy type fish, and that's all they bring up, and that's what they do for their job. And then they turn it, through the grant that we had provided, they turned it into flour. So they ground them all up and it became flour. It was actual protein to add and be sold to health centers, etc., so that would just improve the people's diets. They would have not only the fish, but also something that they could add to some of their main food. This lady was just a great character. She was about, I think, 80 years old when I met her, and I'm not sure if she's still around, but she was a recipient of a cow. So modeling after a heifer project, which I'm sure you've heard about, ADF did something similar, which is like, you have a group of people, you get a cow, a pregnant one, then you pass on that calf to the next person. So this lady got her first cow, and her responses when I went to see her is like, she couldn't thank us enough. And again, I'm just somebody coming in for a few weeks, right? But just coming in and saying, I would have never thought that at my age I could own a cow. Mm-hmm. I mean, that was a big deal. So I think a lot of the learnings that, I might share with you, a couple of stories just briefly. One of the ways that we had to work with these projects is trying to figure out where the knowledge is. Oftentimes I think a lot of us coming in from the outside, I know myself that as I went into Togo as a volunteer, we thought we had the answers. We thought we knew it all because we had the exposure to the world, right? So we were coming in to solve problems and do things and like I say, help the world. That notion of a helper versus a facilitator is a real fine line. And it's really hard to back yourself off from being the helper and doing it for them rather than being the facilitator, or I would call it more the devil's advocate, of trying to pull out from people what their real problem is or what their real need is, right? And mind you, most of Africa had been colonized by French, British, Germans, all over time, and they've had various people come in and out. They've had many other aid agencies that work specifically with people like myself going over and making a lot of those decisions. The way that USADF worked was to not do that, but to actually go work with African staff. So all of our staff in the countries were African. No Americans were based overseas. I got to be the lucky one that got to travel to go see them. But our work was to really work with the groups, sit out under the mango tree for 6 hours and try to figure out what the problem was that they were trying to solve. Because oftentimes, having had that kind of exposure and mentality, they might put down, okay, we want to make bread. It's like, well, okay, but why do you want to make bread? And so it was like, well, and it was more just, they didn't really have great answers, but it's because they've said it before, and it's what they thought the donors, i.e. people like me, wanted to hear. So by the time you kind of go through hours of conversation and sift through the cobwebs and get down to what is the real problem, because what's the point of investing, and this would be taxpayers' money, for a grant to community X, why would you do that if it wasn't going to help really move it forward at least a few steps towards solving that problem? But those challenges were constant. But that was one of the loves I think I have of the job, is being able to sit with the community, working with my local staff person who was translating for me. Because again, I've got a couple of local languages, which, by the way, the music you heard today, the couple African pieces were Swahili, so from East Africa. But having a translator with me, then I could kind of, understand better that I was getting right to the root problem after we asked enough questions. So a couple examples. We went out to a group in Zimbabwe once that said that they wanted to make furniture. And I got there and it was a group of women. And I thought, well, that's really odd. It's really not a traditional occupation for women to make furniture. So we were sitting around in a group and we were talking. And finally I just said, okay, so why do you want to make furniture? Why this rather than raising chickens, for example, which would have been much more traditional. And they said, they thought about it for a minute, and finally one woman got up and she grabbed a chair and she held it up and she said, see this? It's got a broken leg. I can't afford to make a new one. I want to know how to fix it. I was like, okay, you convinced me that this is something that you have decided as a need in the group, and it's not just one person's idea, but it really is a whole participatory process. The group itself has decided that this is something they want to be committed to and engaged in. Another one, a more funny example perhaps in my mind, is out in the little tiny mountains of Lesotho, which is kind of surrounded by South Africa, a very, very small country. We had gotten a request here to make candles. And this was a group of women, again, up in the mountain community. They wanted to make and sell candles for their church, but also as an income generator for the group. And so we got there, and again, through my translator, they were talking about it, but we're kind of going around in circles after about 45 minutes. And so finally, they were all chit-chatting and not really, paying a lot of great attention. So finally, I just, shouted out through my translator. I said, so I'm here today because I heard you want to raise chickens. And there was all of a sudden dead silence in the room. And they kind of sort of quizzically started looking at each other, and then a little bit of whispering here and there. And it was like, who the heck is this crazy woman who thinks that we want to do chickens, Finally, they said, no, we want to make candles, And so finally, I couldn't hold it anymore. I just burst out laughing, and they realized that I had tricked them into telling me what it was that they wanted to do. So this kind of sort of devil's advocacy and playing a game in a sense, if you will, but just testing, I think I would say, is just checking out, how do I verify that this is really their idea, and it's really a need that the community has felt and that they want to do something about. So things like that were always the trigger for me to say, okay, yeah, I think I've got enough faith in what I've heard today that I want to take it the next step, and we'll do a little bit more, analysis. Where would you get the raw materials? How would you make it? What technology do you need to know? What do you know already? What is the indigenous knowledge that exists, and how do we build on that? Rather than assuming that we've got the answer on making candles and bringing in everything from the U.S., we try to find, whatever exists locally and take it from there. So that was the big one. And then probably another, just last story on that one, another group of women, we tried to get exchanges between women's groups in particular, or farmer cooperatives in general. So even within the same country, groups are very, very isolated. Transportation networks are very difficult. You can have a group in the northern part of the country that doesn't even know that the same thing has been tried many times over in another part of the country or next door. So we took a group, provided money for a group to go from Lesotho to Zimbabwe to visit another project. And they had a great time. They spent about a week doing that. When they got back, I got a letter from the women's group that had traveled, and they said, Miss Christine, we can't thank you enough. We've always wondered, and now we know how clouds stay in the sky, because they'd been in a plane for the first time in their lives, right? So that was their takeaway to me was, we know now how clouds stay in the sky. We saw it, So it's like, okay, well, if that's the biggest thing that goes in your mind, that's great. But they did carry out their project. Besides that, they did a great job. So I think just to say that, it's there's no shortage of great ideas, but the challenge is in helping anybody, whether it be this country or my work in Africa. You've got to take it with a view, I think, towards sustainability and not creating dependency. Because I think that's a whole lot of what's happened over the years with foreign aid. In particular, it's been that mentality of we know best, and we're coming in with our approach, our solutions. And what I really liked about ADF, and again, going from the people-to-people aspect of Peace Corps, this then became the natural sort of follow on for me as a government to people solution, where I was government, but I was there to listen to the people and find out what they really needed and try to help themselves even better. So that seemed to be a natural progression to what I guess I would call sustainability or empowerment in particular. As you try to define what empowerment means, it's hard to visualize sometimes, but it does exist, and you know it when you see it. And so with that, then I came full cycle home. I retired after some 30 years, moved back to Southampton, and my friends in DC are saying, well, what are you going to do in Southampton? It's like, well, I don't know, I don't have a plan. And I thought, there's universities around, there's like 5 universities nearby, surely I'll find something. One of the first things I fell into was helping refugee immigrants to the States, folks that had just been actually coming from the Congo. I saw an ad in the paper saying that a group of Congolese family had just arrived, and they had arrived via refugee camps in Burundi, where they'd been stationed for like 5 years before they were able to come to the States through the Catholic Church services. And I said, well, gosh, I've been to the Congo, I've lived there, I know Burundi, surely I speak French, surely I can be of service again. So I offered my help as a volunteer and got involved with that. And then later on, decided to volunteer for various town committees and got elected to a few of those and volunteered for a few too many more. So that's kind of the story of it. So it's basically, what started out as, I don't know where I'm going, I've landed somewhere, and I've enjoyed every part of the journey and the crossroads I think that I've had to take. So the journey still continues. Don't know what's at the end of the journey, but the path is still there. So I encourage anybody who is thinking that they may have to figure it all out and know what they're doing at any given moment, is just let life be. Let it speak to you and figure out what might be appropriate at the right time. So that's about it, but I'll be quiet, and I'll be around for questions later on too. So thanks.